In the early 1950s, Jim Crow operated as a highly institutionalized system of racial segregation. Across the American South, local laws and state violence dictated everyday life, enforcing strict physical boundaries in public spaces. Dismantling the system presented a massive logistical hurdle. Civil rights advocates had to figure out how to defeat a legal structure when the police, the judges, and the lawmakers were the very people actively enforcing it. At the federal level, this system was protected by the separate but equal legal doctrine, a precedent that provided constitutional cover for segregated facilities. Because the federal government legitimized Jim Crow, a purely moral argument would fail. The first strike against segregation had to systematically destroy its underlying legal foundation. Decades of strategic litigation by the NAACP ultimately led to the steps of the United States Supreme Court in the 1954 case Brown v. Board of Education. In a unanimous decision, the court explicitly dismantled this separate but equal doctrine, ruling that segregated public schools were inherently unequal and therefore unconstitutional. But the mandate contained a critical flaw. The court ordered states to desegregate with all deliberate speed, a vague phrase completely lacking a hard deadline. Southern politicians exploited this loophole immediately. They drafted the Southern Manifesto, explicitly pledging to defy the Supreme Court and launch a campaign of massive resistance against integration. This political backlash exposed a harsh reality. A legal victory written on paper held zero power without physical enforcement. The battle had to shift from courtroom theory to street-level disruption. That shift started in Montgomery, Alabama, in December 1955, when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to yield her bus seat to a white passenger. Local organizers immediately mobilized, electing a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. to lead a citywide boycott of the bus system. Under King's leadership, the community deployed nonviolence as a highly disciplined, aggressive strategy of economic disruption. The logistics required immense coordination. Organizers engineered an intricate network of 300 carpools and coordinated mass walking campaigns, entirely starving the transit system of revenue for over a year. The sustained financial hemorrhaging eventually broke the local transit authority, forcing the city to integrate its buses. Montgomery provided a scalable blueprint. Everyday citizens proved they could engineer localized economic crises to force systemic change, even when local lawmakers refused to yield. While boycott successfully integrated individual cities, the process was far too slow to dismantle Jim Crow nationally. The movement required a tactic severe enough to force federal intervention. In 1961, organizations like CORE and SNCC launched the Freedom Rides. Brave activists boarded interstate buses, specifically aiming to violate unjust segregation laws as they traveled directly across state lines. They willingly rode directly into extreme mob violence. Local police deliberately stood down, allowing the riders to endure brutal attacks in order to manufacture an unavoidable crisis. This entire strategy relied on constructive tension. By forcing the brutality of segregation out into the open and broadcasting it on national television, the activists cornered the federal government. By absorbing extreme physical violence, the riders successfully escalated localized Southern racism into a national emergency that demanded a response from Washington. By 1963, the movement needed to leverage this mounting tension through a massive, unified display of numbers to demand sweeping federal legislation. The March on Washington executed this perfectly. It was a massive logistical feat designed to physically occupy the Capitol with 250,000 people. Internally, the coalition faced severe friction. Young leaders like John Lewis prepared speeches heavily criticizing the federal government's weak, slow-moving legislative efforts. This map illustrates the international pressure mounting at the exact same time. Images of racial violence from Birmingham and Montgomery were broadcast into the Soviet Union and the Global South, turning segregation into a severe geopolitical liability for the United States during the Cold War. This massive domestic mobilization, combined with deep international embarrassment, created a two-front political trap that left the federal government no choice but to intervene. The political climax fell to the Johnson administration, which faced the immense task of breaking a long-standing congressional deadlock. Leveraging his political capital, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, legally outlawing institutionalized discrimination based on race across the country. The fall of Jim Crow was the direct result of a masterclass in strategic escalation. The civil rights movement proved that systemic injustice only breaks when civic action systematically scales up, moving from the courtroom to the economy and finally into the streets to force the hand of power.